So I'm here again with Vivienne, and this is part 3 of looking at COVID-19 and trauma. And it's July 2020 and Ireland is reopening and people are starting to return to particular places. And one thing we want to talk about is some of the cycles around trauma that can be taking place when we leave our homes and go back to places like restaurants, community spaces, places of worship, support groups, and how maybe it isn't as simple as just it's good to get back to them, end of story. That there's something maybe more going on when it comes to trauma. So Vivienne, what are some of the things maybe we need to be aware of when any of us are returning to group settings in the coming days and weeks?
Yeah. I know that from possibly hearing stories of how churches are going back, that people are being divided into groups. They're being divided into family groups. They're being divided into ethnic groups. They're being divided into gender groups, married single groups, family groups. And so many of these to be safe. And in doing that, we are making some people feel that they don't belong. And to not belong and to be outside of is probably one of the greatest woundings that a human being can have. And it is also a shame wounding. And so people, the spotlight has been put on people who feel that I'm different. And even in a even from a gendered group, that I'm other. And to really, maybe from a minister's point of view, maybe from the elders, pastoral care teams, to do a little piece of work around uncoupling what possibly are childhood wounds of being different, of being ostracized, of not belonging, and saying, this is not that. This is not that. This is different. Now that's really difficult to do that uncoupling, and teaching possibly some self-compassion, which I know is maybe causes a little tweaking in some theological thinking. That I talk to myself and I tell myself I'm okay, because very often in churches the message is you're not okay, and we know we're not okay, and that's why we need Jesus, but on a different level. That I'm okay, I'm safe here, and maybe even just doing some self-touch, just the hands here. I'm okay. I'm really struggling right now. I feel outside the group. I feel a little bit ostracized, but I'm okay. This is not that. And trying to, the dual awareness of present day thinking and trauma and being trauma informed. And I think even there's a bilateral movement, but you can do it before you go into church. You may not do it in church, but though you could do it very gently on your knees, is the butterfly hug and tapping, and tap the message in. I'm safe here. I'm safe here. It's okay. It's not that they don't love me. They want me to be safe. Those kind of things. And some people, because of history, might even find just touching their body difficult. So, if they can maybe get a good image or something. But I think that kind of, just to go through some little questions, sitting in church, what's on my mind now? Is my mind, as we talk, is my mind foggy? Is my mind clear? What's happening in my body sensations, and not pushing them away, sitting with them? What's my breath like? Am I restricting? Am I holding? What are my emotions? Are they fearful? Are they rejoicing to be back with people? What's my energy like? Is it excited? Is it restricted? Checking those things out. What we're doing in doing that is, and we have, with this whole, we're teaching, what I'd be saying, it's for the minister, be teaching a little bit of mindfulness. But I've actually been reading a book by a beautiful woman, and a beautiful book. Her name is Christine Caldwell, and it's called Bodyfulness. And she's taken the emphasis away from mindfulness into our bodies, but including mindfulness, because mindfulness has this image of mentalizing, where she's saying we need to somaticize it a little bit more. And I think all of this fits very nicely for us as Christians, because the Bible was at it first. Consider your ways, consider the lilies, consider the creation, learning mindful moment-to-moment stuff, because trauma is going back into the past. So maybe teaching a little bit mindfulness in church, but calling it considering, so as we don't. Let's do a little bit of considering, or a little bit of momentary awareness. What are you feeling in your body right now? I don't know if we can ever get to that.
I guess, it's,
because we, of
we'll
all
see.
people, have, I think churches of all groups have desomaticized how we worship, if there is such a word. But bodyfulness, if there is such a word as desomaticizing, bodyfulness is a whole new word that we try to come into our bodies. Does that answer that, Richard?
Yeah, it does. I think there's a when we think about returning to any group settings in society, we see it as a good thing, which it is, to get back into those spaces. Yeah. That's true. We see it, secondly, as a space where we need to minimize risk of COVID-19, and that's also true. And so we see, everyone from staff in restaurants to church staff to others taking measures, and that's all also very good and very important. But what you've introduced, in a sense, is a third aspect, which is linked to both of those, but it's that in returning to a space where there's a new picture of risk, and we might even say danger, we all, whether we're hosts of spaces or guests into spaces, we all have to be aware that there's a trauma lens needs to be brought to that entering a space of danger. That isn't merely just, you're safe because we've minimized COVID-19 risk and it's great to be back together. Those two things may be true, but in a sense, there's another layer, another lens we need to bring to our gathered spaces, which is the lens of trauma.
And shame.
And shame.
And shame. Would you mind sitting over there because you're... what does that do to someone who has a shame history? Just being aware of that, trying to minimize that Martin Buber space, making that safe. And there's a big job out there for the leaders of churches.
And the other space that's coming up, because it was announced yesterday here in Ireland, is schools, because we're also going to be returning hundreds of thousands of pupils to schools in a few weeks, and teachers and staff in the schools. And so again, it's that theme there where it's great to be back in school. How can we minimize the COVID-19 risk, and how can that practically be played out? That's the big debate that's happening right now. Will schools be ready? And their readiness, and also the readiness of having extra guidance counselors and even psychologists to support pupils in some of that. But I guess a trauma-informed lens means also being aware that even the act of entering and how that space is handled itself is something that will need considering. And we were, by those in charge of the schools. We were saying
earlier, Richard, that some little 5-year-old who's has to not sit with his friend and has already felt difference and has already felt exclusion and has already felt, we don't have as nice a house and nice a car, a bigger garden, different history. And then they're asked to sit over here, and 20 years later, they present in therapy with, I've got these strange sensations in my body when I do such and such, and I don't know where they're coming from. And they're coming from another 5. And it would be wonderful if, and you see, teachers are such a task now, if some of this self-compassion, even just teaching this to a little 5-year-old, I'm welcome here. I'm welcome. I'm okay. If some of that could even be taught, for 2 minutes in the morning or something. I don't know. I'm not an educator. But I just know that we need our bodies to know they're safe, or we'll have all of these triggers for the rest of our lives.
Great. Thanks, Vivienne. There's lots to think about there when it comes to returning to places, returning into group settings, that it's not just about the joy of connecting with people, which is great and wonderful. It's not just about minimizing COVID-19 risk. It's about having a trauma-informed lens into how those places operate. And it looks like, and I wonder if we could just finish on this, that we're going to need that for a while. There'll be continuing reopening or maybe even reclosing going on. What do you see as the medium to long-term story of needing this lens into our spaces that we enter with one another?
And we talked about this before, Richard, that we can't do trauma work while people are still traumatized, because people have to be safe in order to look at their trauma. And so we have a very vulnerable population in church and school, and it's looking at these. I think it's resourcing before we process. And some of the resourcing might seem like a sticking plaster, like getting everybody that comes over for dinner next Saturday night to do a vouside to relax themselves before we all eat together, something, have a bit of fun with it. But it's a whole societal shift of learning not to shame. Yeah, that's just what I'm thinking.
That's a big task. Thanks, Vivienne.
Okay.